Good afternoon, everyone. For our next guest, we have Poppy MacDonald. She joined Steve Ballmer to launch USAFacts.org in 2017 and has developed a platform through which users can access thousands of data sets from government agencies for analysis. Today, USA Facts partners with news organizations, including US News, to help journalists enhance their content through government-sourced data sets and to better inform readers. Today, she joins our finance editor, Jon Marino. So please welcome Jon and Poppy. Thanks.
Hello.
All right, thank you very much, Josh, for that intro. So to get started, for the folks in the audience and for the journalists in the audience, I personally spend a lot of my time working with private companies' data and some public companies' data. On the other hand, you have access to a trove of government data. So tell us a little bit about what USA Facts does.
Sure. So USA Facts is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan data initiative to bring government data to people and make it accessible and usable. So we've combined data from over 70 federal agencies and put it into context based on what are the issues that people care about. We do an annual report, which I'm holding here for the government, on behalf of the government every year, as well as a 10K, which, as you probably know, corporations are required to file every year with the SEC. So we do that for the government on behalf of their shareholders, who are the taxpayers. And in addition to that, at USAFacts.org, we have a searchable library of government data. 70 federal agencies right now. We keep adding to it. We came about because when Steve Ballmer left as CEO of Microsoft, he was starting his philanthropic initiative, and he wanted to help kids, lift kids out of poverty. But he knew that government already does a lot to tackle that issue. And so he wanted to understand what are the gaps in government spending. So he asked a few hack professionals from his finance team at Microsoft, and they said, give us 2 weeks, and we'll compile that data for you. And about 6 months later, they said, this is impossible. Looking at an issue like poverty, yes, that government data is available, and it's technically accessible, but it's really hard to parse out. When you're looking at poverty, you have to go to HHS to get Head Start funding. You have to go to Department of Housing to get housing subsidies. You're going to multiple federal agencies and trying to figure out what exactly is spent. And eventually they did compile that for him, and he thought, okay, if it's this hard for me to get data out of the government, how hard must it be for an individual voter who's trying to make sense of what they're hearing in the media or what they're hearing a politician say? And how hard must it be for people in the government to actually make sense, policymakers, as they're trying to make decisions? So USA Facts was born. I've been president for just over a year now, and my goal has really been in 3 areas. We built this database, but how do we make it more accessible to people? So doing more storytelling of what's interesting in that data. Why does it matter to you as a citizen? Add more data. So hopefully to benefit you all as well. It's all publicly available. There are 90,000 government entities in the US, so how do we get all of that data in one place, rolling up local, state, and federal data? And also to advocate, the data should be accessible. So what should governments be collecting? How often should they be reporting it? And how should it be reported? So that's really what I've been working on at USA Facts.
And kind of bring some rules to the Wild West of data.
We hope so.
All right, I'm going to go through a number of slides here for our audience. Okay. The first one is actually produced by Thinknum. We recently created a report covering board gender diversity and its impact on S&P 500 companies. The blues on the right are technology companies, and on the left you've got, with the thumbs down sign, more companies from the S&P 500, all of which lie outside of the technology sector. The purpose of the image here that we're sharing is that the companies all the way on the left, the blue technology companies, offer much more paternity leaves. This happens to go hand in hand with the fact that they have more women serving on their boards. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to talk through some of the data that you've created, Poppy. And if you want, just take us right through these slides in any pace that you like.
Right. So the holy grail for us is to visualize government data in a way that people can understand big, complex numbers. So in this case, we wanted to show what is all the revenue that's collected by the federal government, from actually local, state, and federal, all rolled up, and what are those sources of revenue. Probably don't need to tell you that a Sankey diagram based on the width shows you the size, and in this case, it's total size of spending. So you can see most of the revenue comes from taxes. In the bottom there, you can see what that deficit is in between what we spend, which is total spending on the right, and then you can get a sense of what our priorities are as a country. What are we spending revenue against? What are the issues that we're trying to tackle? There are actually kind of 8 major areas that we have to fund as a government: Social Security and Medicare, and what the dollars that we provide to senior citizens are about 50% of that revenue. And if you look at how we've organized it, you may see some words that hopefully you're familiar with. It's our Constitution. So when we thought about federal agencies are not necessarily organized based on tackling real issues in America. So how could we organize local, state, and federal data in a way that's easy to understand? And we decided to go back to why our country was founded. It was the Constitution, why we were established. So we've organized the buckets of data under things like ensure justice and domestic tranquility, and what falls under that bucket. So you can go in and click into each of these and see the size of spending, and you can also look at what are the outcomes. So is healthcare improving, and what's the data that falls into those buckets? If you click on one more, just looking at revenue, so here is just a more of a snapshot where you can look just at revenue and what are the sources of that revenue. As I mentioned, tax revenue makes up the bulk of our total revenue as a country. And if you click one more time, you could look specifically at corporate income taxes. I think some people are surprised that that makes up such a small percent of our total revenue, 7%. I think a lot of people say, corporations pay too much taxes or corporations aren't paying enough. Whatever side you're on the debate, I think a lot of people are surprised that it makes up such a small percent as we're looking at a deficit or overall debt that corporations, that's a tiny part. We also look at specifically, if you want to do the next slide, great. How do people live? So when you talk about the middle class, what is that? And I think a lot of people probably describe themselves as middle class, but what does that actually look like for America? And we would best say what would be the middle 20% of the country. I also think people are surprised if you look at that middle 20%, which is the third up from the bottom, that the income for the middle 20% in America is between $33,000 and $66,000 a year. And that is comprised of, on average, market income, so what's coming from wages is about $48,000. And then you see transfers. That is dollars that go from the government to the middle class directly, and how much they pay in taxes. So if you click one more, looking specifically at transfers, I also think it's surprising for people to know that even the top 0.1% receive transfers from the government. So you think about, are we subsidizing people's cost of living? Yes, across the board we are, and it's not that different. The top 0.1%, obviously bottom kind of and second 20 do receive significantly more, but the middle 20 get about the same as the top 0.1%. That's things like Social Security and Medicare that are not based on income. So we're all benefiting, we're all getting something back from the government. And I think if you click one more, you can look at how we pay taxes in this country. So for the middle 20% and below, they're contributing significantly more of their total wages, and they're paying more of that as a percent in taxes, but who's actually paying the bulk of taxes that support the revenue we need for the country? That's certainly more in the top 20%. So there's just a couple of examples of how we visualize complex government data, but certainly a lot more available at USAFacts.org.
All right. Coming up next, actually, we have a number of journalists who are going to be talking about data for their respective professions. They're somewhere out there in the audience, or at the very least, they're listening in the green room. And the reason that I'm saying that is because both you and I work with folks in the press to basically help people present a little bit more detailed stories through their data. And so the question for you that I'd like to ask is, what are some of the best projects that you've already been able to collaborate on? And I realize, as a journalist, there's not much you can say about going forward, but if you want to talk about some of the things that are coming up and maybe not your partners, that would be great for the audience too.
Absolutely. So one of my goals is to make more people aware of the fact that USAFacts.org exists. It's a free resource, and our hope is that people will use data to drive decision making, and that while we may very much disagree on the right policy, we should all start with the facts. And so we are looking for partners that can help us reach new audiences. One of the exciting partnerships we kicked off about 3 weeks ago is with US News and World Reports. We're their 2020 election coverage partner. So as they're each Monday huddling as a newsroom to say what are the stories we're going to cover, USAFacts joins that conversation, and we talk about what are the government data points, or what are the visualizations that we can provide that would shed interesting light on what that candidate is saying or what's being debated in the news. So we've really enjoyed that initial partnership, and we'll hopefully remain their partner through the election. Another thing that we are doing is we are out in the market with a poll right now. We're working with NORC, which is the polling organization at University of Chicago, and the AP. And we are talking to people about how they're feeling about facts right now at this time in America. It's our third time doing the poll, and probably not surprising, what we're finding is people generally feel like they can assess what is fact versus fiction, but they feel like they get very different stories from politicians and from the media. And I do think that's a really unique opportunity for USAFacts and data and facts to become a real a trust builder, right? If you're turning on MSNBC and you're turning on Fox and you're hearing two very different sides of a story, it's confusing. But if they were all starting with the same set of facts, if politicians say we can all agree this is the starting point, this is where we are as a country, we just disagree on the solution, and this is the outcome we want to drive, and let's track it, I think we can really make a difference in terms of people rebuilding trust that we are all working with the same data. So we're certainly looking for more opportunities to partner with organizations, to partner with media, and really just make people aware of the asset that we have available.
All right, I'm going to preface this next one by saying, everyone, get your flu shot, because if you don't, we'll know, and then we're going to talk about it. One of the things that USAFacts can track is public health crises. It could be valuable for governments, it could be valuable for healthcare providers, it's obviously valuable for media. So what are your plans to put data like this to work going forward?
Absolutely. So healthcare crises like the outbreak of the moment, probably USAFacts less helpful, right? Because we're doing published government data. But I do think it shines a light on what is happening over time with healthcare issues and what's the real story. What are the facts behind some of the things we're following in the news? So, for example, healthcare spending. We know that it has gone up about 59% on a per person basis since 1999. But if you look at our site, you can track life expectancy and average age of death, and we're not significantly impacting either of those numbers. So we're spending more, but you could argue, are we actually improving life? You can also look at issues that have been continuing over time. So obesity rates have actually tripled over the last 50 years. I think, John, you noticed some stats about vaping. So in a bad news issue, 1 in 5 teens in 2018 were vaping. I guess in I don't know if you call this a good news issue, smoking rates have plateaued among teens. You can also look at things like vaccines. I think there's been a concern that there is an anti-vaccination movement, and what is happening with vaccines. This is where government data does create a challenge. The last reported vaccination rate was from 2017, and it showed a slight decrease of 2% from where people were vaccinating in 2015, so from 85% to 83%. But it doesn't really tell us a lot about the concern that's being raised right now, what is actually happening based on real data. So that's where we try to shine a light. Opioids, another crisis. So you can see things on our site like, well, what is the impact of opioids? Well, for the first time, more people are enrolling for opioid addiction treatment than for alcohol abuse. But at the same time, while opioids are killing now more people than cars or guns, it's the same death rate as suicides. And I don't think you hear as much in the news about suicides as you do in opioids. So as people are trying to get a context for what is really happening, what is the size of this problem in the data, not adjectives, and what is happening in my community. For opioids, we allow people to search on their zip code to really take it down to a local level.
Wow. All right, on to maybe more optimistic content here. Job growth is back, but unfortunately wage growth is not. What does your data say that might account for the trend?
So I don't think government data necessarily gives the answer for why job growth is up, but wages have remained stagnant. If you come to our site, though, you could see that wages have been stagnant since 2001. So there really hasn't been a change. This isn't a new phenomenon. And you've got the government subsidizing the middle class. So the middle class has seen wages remain stagnant, but they're receiving about 59% more in government transfers. So you can look at overall on an income, people in the middle class are living about the same, but it's because of government subsidies. And you can also look at when you say wage growth has been stagnant, is that the case for every job in every industry? It's obviously not. So we look at by industry, by profession, what is happening with wages. And in certain jobs at the higher end and the lower end, so if you look at higher end jobs like in management and healthcare, or lower end jobs like in food services, we've actually seen a 10% growth in wages. But if you look at some of the jobs, other jobs, like in education or industrial services, we've actually seen a decrease in wages by 9%. So certainly that overall trend is impacting people differently based on their industry.
One thing that I'm kind of curious about, and I think that we spoke about this when we were preparing for the event, is kind of the quality of data. You have access to a ton of federal data. You also use state data. I mean, obviously, it's something that we grapple with as well, making sure that we have access to the best data and to the most accurate data, and also kind of fine-tuning when you're not 100% certain about what you're looking at. Can you kind of spend a little bit of time talking about standards and just how it applies to you, maybe also how it's going to apply to some of the folks in the audience?
Yeah, well, our big goal is to bring all those 90,000 local government entities' data online and available and allow people to use it and make sense of it. Right now, that feels like an enormous task that we definitely won't achieve in Steve Ballmer's lifetime or my lifetime because it is so hard to access that data. There is no standardization for what is collected, when it's reported, and how it's reported. There was federal legislation that by 2020, federal data should be publicly available and accessible online, but that just takes care of a small percent of the pie. And I think as people are really looking at, is the country headed in the wrong or right direction? At the end of the day, they want to be able to look at their local neighborhood. Do I live in a safer place? Are my schools educating my children better? And we can't really get to that until we can get all these local government entities online. So part of what we're doing, and I think you're hearing from Nick Hart, who leads the Data Coalition, who's also really working on this, is advocating to government to start standardizing what is reported and how often, and that will take us a long way towards being able to scale our own database that we're making available for the public, but there's definitely a lot of work to be done.
All right. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the future of data. So what data sets do you envision coming online for real-time access in the next 5 to 10 years, and also how are we going to be able to measure effectively through them?
Yeah, so for USAFacts, we are starting to scale to get state data across every major issue. You can go to our site now and see, look at for each your state and compare it to other states and look how you're doing on things like healthcare, education, transportation. So in terms of for USAFacts, we're going to continue to scale that data that's available. But I'm really hopeful that there are areas where there are hot topics for the country and things that are being debated in the election right now, but that there really isn't real-time data access. You've got things like jobs numbers that are reported on a monthly basis, but when you look at something like immigration, the last time we had an account of undocumented immigrants was from 2015, and I think as that continues to be part of the public discussion, there's going to be a big focus to get more accurate and real-time data around things like immigration. Childcare has been a hot topic, and really we have one data point from the government, and that's out-of-pocket costs for childcare, but there really isn't information about availability or accessibility or how that's impacting people's participation in the workforce. So we will continue to advocate with our colleagues to get that information online in real time, and that's a big goal for USAFacts is to make it available and accessible.
All right. So before I joined Thinknum, my prior employer was a consulting firm, and we used to do things like work with major metropolitan areas, municipal services, to do things like install devices within sewers to basically gauge water as it flowed through a sewer. And this is in its very early and nascent stages, but the idea behind this is that you're going to be able to track things like rainwater, stormwater, et cetera, like that in real time. The reason that I personally think that this is valuable is that in the event of a natural disaster, a hurricane, et cetera, you're going to be able to gauge on a zip code basis exactly what resources you need to deploy where. We can't track this right now. I would love to. It would be fascinating. So the reason that I'm leading in with all of this is, what data set do you not have access to that would kind of be like your fantasy data set, like your dream data set, whatever that could be? What is it and how would you approach it?
From a personal perspective, I would love to see more data about how men and women are being paid in the same job in a company and what the discrepancies are. I think until we start reporting that data, until we're not going to see change. Like, without measurement, there can't be improvement or progress. So from a personal perspective, I would love to see that data required by the government and made available. But from a policy debate standpoint, I do think information about childcare, access to childcare, affordability of childcare, more information about immigration and how immigrants do or don't contribute to the economy would really help bring data into a conversation that can be fueled by a lot of rhetoric.
All right. What is next for USAFacts? What's coming up?
Yeah, so for USAFacts, we are, again, working to definitely add more data, so you'll see more state and local data come online and be available on our platform. We are relaunching our site in January, so you'll be seeing opportunities as we've migrated from being just a database to publishing a lot more content, doing a lot more data visualization, highlighting that right up front as you come to our site. We're working on improving search. So that doesn't just mean on our platform that you can find the government data you need, but we fundamentally think in the goal of making it accessible, people shouldn't have to come to usafacts.org. So when you run a Google or, as my boss would say, a Bing search, which I'm sure everyone does first, that data should pop right up without you having to come to our site. So thinking about how we make it more accessible. I think from a perspective of what are we publishing, we've got the AP NORC poll that we'll be releasing next week. Steve will be on Trevor Noah, so tune in on Wednesday of next week to share that data. We're doing a Thanksgiving fact sheet. We think a lot of drama and challenges happen around the Thanksgiving table when people are having debates not rooted in facts. So we're anticipating what your family's going to be grilling you on and giving you the facts at hand so you can have that discussion hopefully in a productive way where you agree on the facts but maybe disagree on the solutions. And in January, we are going to be unveiling a State of the Union by the numbers. So we think there's a real opportunity typically when a president gets up and talks about the State of the Union, it's in adjectives. It's the economy's never been so strong. We've never been so successful, in creating jobs, and it's not based in data. So we are going to Trump, but nothing, we would do this for any president of any party. We're nonpartisan. We just think it's important this year and moving forward, no matter who's in the White House, that the American public has access to what is the State of the Union based on the numbers. And we've got a prominent Republican senator and prominent Democratic senator who also think this is really important and will be helping us roll that out.
That's really cool. It would be interesting from my perspective to see a list published in real time of kind of the search trends that go over the course of Thanksgiving. So one of the things, I'm going to veer off script for a little bit since we managed to get into talking about Washington. Yeah. The current administration is really rewriting a number of rules at a pace that's almost unforeseen. How does that impact your data gathering?
That is a good question. I mean, I don't want to say it can't be any harder than it is right now to get access to the data. And the fortunate thing is when we go to federal agencies, they say our mandate is not provide data, right? Like that is something that they are required to do, but it's not sort of the first thing that they come into the office to do every day. So a lot of agencies have said, FOIA us, do a Freedom of Information Act. It's the only way you're going to get us focused on giving you this data. So we've had a friendly reception when we've gone in and said, how do we get better access to your data? And in all cases, we find people are willing to share, but in some cases, we have to like physically bring in a thumb drive to download the data. In the case of the IRS, it comes to us on CDs. And I'm thinking, do we even have a way to get information off CDs anymore? And we do in the case of the IRS. And so I would say, I don't know, I hope it can't get any more challenging. I think Nick Hart would know better when he speaks later, but the Data Coalition has had a friendly reception from people on the right and the left, as has USAFacts, in the belief that this data should be accessible. And I'm hoping, as Trump having been a businessman like Steve, to try to run an organization without access to data. I know this conference presumes when you're looking for external data, you're supplementing the data you already have about your own organization. The US government doesn't really have that data rolled up in a way that is usable to make decisions and to really understand, are we driving the outcomes we want to see for the country?
The only way I can imagine things getting worse would be if someone sent you a floppy disk.
Yeah, that could be really hard.
Only half the audience even got that. All right, so we're almost out of time here. I've lived in one, visited the other a ton of times. You've lived in both. We're in New York. It's a safe space. Washington or Seattle?
Cape Town, South Africa, for sure. I got to find my way to get there.
All right. Folks, we're going to take a break for about 15 or so minutes before we come back on with our last two panels. Please give us a very big round for Poppy MacDonald.
Thank you.